Stop. Don't put those hands on my glass. You leave a smudge on a case like this and I'm billing you for it. And trust me, lady, you couldn't cover the polishing cloth, let alone the watch. You hear me? You are nothing standing in front of something worth more than every year you've been alive put together. Look at you. The shoes. The bag held together with, is that tape? You wandered off the wrong concourse. Sweetheart, the food court's 2 gates down. This counter is for travelers. Real ones. The kind with a boarding pass to somewhere that matters, and a wrist that's earned a thing like this. Not for whatever the cleaning crew forgot to walk out the back. So here's me being generous. Turn around. Shuffle yourself back toward the pretzel. Stand where you belong. And don't breathe on my display on the way. I've got a client coming through in 20 minutes who's flying private. And I will not have him see something like you, leaning on my counter, like you have any business here. And the woman he was hissing all that at Della Mayfield, 73 years old. Standing very still in a gray cardigan with a tote bag worn soft at the corners. A woman who had spent 38 years of her life turning raw titanium into parts that flew higher than any jet in that terminal would ever climb, looked at the young man behind the glass for a long one. Long moment. She did not flinch. She did not leave. She just looked at him. The way you look at a machine that's running rough and you already know exactly which bearing is about to fail. Then she said, very quietly, I'm not here to buy anything. Son, I'm here because somebody called me. He laughed. Of course he laughed. This is the story of Della Mayfield and one ordinary Tuesday afternoon at Gate C. In a glass-walled boutique inside one of the busiest airports in the country. And how a thing that man behind the counter said he'd never need, never in 1,000 years, turned out to be the only thing standing between him and ruin. Stay with me. Because the part that gets me isn't the cruelty. It's how sure he was. How completely, smugly sure. Let me take you back a few hours, so you understand who was actually standing at that counter. Della Mayfield had not planned to be at the airport at all that day. She'd retired 4 years earlier from a precision components plant out past the industrial corridor west of the city, the kind of place most people drive past without ever wondering what's made inside. What was made inside, among other things, were the tiny escapement parts and balance assemblies that go into instruments that cannot be allowed to fail. Altimeters, certain medical devices, and, in the early years of her career, the movements of mechanical watches for a manufacturer that has since become very famous and very expensive. Della had started on that line at 24. A young woman with steady hands and a way of hearing when a thing was wrong before any gauge could measure it. By 30, she was running the bench. By 40, she was the person they flew in when a movement came back from a buyer in Geneva with a fault nobody else could find. She had hands. Is the thing. The kind of hands that take 50 years to make and that no school can teach. She could feel a hair spring out of true through a loop and a pair of tweezers the way a mother feels a fever through the back of her hand. Nobody at that airport boutique knew any of that. They saw a small, older woman in worn shoes, and they made up the rest. The reason she was there, her late husband's watch. Earl Mayfield had carried a steel chronograph on his wrist every day of the 31 years they were married. A watch he'd bought with his first real paycheck as a machinist himself, back before he met her. Back when buying it had meant 6 months of skipped lunches. It was not a famous watch. It was not worth what the things in that glass case were worth. But it had stopped the week Earl died. The way those old mechanical things sometimes seem to. And Della had not wound it since. 3 years it had sat in a drawer. Frozen, at fear, 12. The last hour, his heart had kept time. She had finally decided she wanted it running again. Not to sell, to wear. To hear it tick on her own wrist the way she used to hear it tick beside her in the dark. The decision hadn't come easy, and it hadn't come fast. For 3 years, the watch had stayed in the drawer of Earl's nightstand, which she had not been able to bring herself to clear out. And every few months, she'd open that drawer for something and see it there. Stopped at 4:12, and closed the drawer again. Her daughter, Renee, had finally said something at Sunday dinner that spring. "Mama, why don't you get Daddy's watch fixed?" "It can't be fixed. Baby, it needs a part nobody makes. You used to make parts nobody made. That was your whole job." Della had set down her fork. "I'm retired. You're 73. Not dead. There's a difference. And you keep mixing them up." Renee had said it gently, but she'd said it. "Daddy wore that thing every day for 31 years. You said yourself it stopped the same week he did. So now it's just going to sit in a drawer being sad? That's not what he'd want, and you know it. He'd want it on somebody's wrist. Going. He hated a thing that didn't work. Remember? He couldn't stand it. And that was true. Earl Mayfield could not abide a tool that didn't do its job. A dull blade. A stuck drawer. A watch that didn't keep time he'd fix it or feel personally insulted by it. The idea of his watch sitting dead in a drawer for 3 years out of his wife's grief would have driven him up a wall. He'd say I was being sentimental. Della had admitted. He'd say you were being a coward about it. Renee had said, and then softened. His words. Not mine. Mama, you know he'd put it just like that. He would have. That was exactly how he'd have put it. And so Della had made some calls. And the calls had led her. Eventually. By way of a kind man with a magnifier strapped to his head. To an airport boutique, and a young man who decided in half a second she didn't belong there. But that's why she was there. Not for a fortune. For her husband's voice in steel. Ticking again. For Earl, who could not stand a thing that didn't work. The trouble was, the movement inside Earl's chronograph was an old caliber, discontinued. The kind that needs a part you cannot order, you have to make it. Or salvage it. Or know somebody who can. Della had called 3 shops in the city. 2 said they couldn't touch it. The third, a kind man with a magnifier strapped to his head, had looked at it for a long time, and then said something that surprised her. Ma'am, the only place in this whole region with the equipment to cut a balance staff for a caliber this old is that authorized service center, the one inside the airport. Of all places, they've got a watchmaker on contract there. Real one. Swiss trained. Supposed to be the best in 3 states. But I'll be honest with you. I've heard he's particular about who he'll see. Particular. That was the word. So that morning, Della had taken the long bus out to the airport. Walked the endless terminal with her tote bag, and her husband's dead watch wrapped in a square of chamois. And found the gleaming little boutique tucked between a duty-free perfume counter and a wine bar. All glass and brushed steel and a single spotlit case of watches that cost more than the house she'd raised 2 children in. And behind the counter stood a young man named Preston Vale. Preston was 29. And Preston was angry at the world in the specific way of a person who believes he was promised more than he got. He'd come up working luxury retail in the city. Moved out to the airport store for the commission on the high-traffic travelers. And he'd talked his way into managing the front of the boutique, even though he could not tell a balance wheel from a bottle cap. That was fine. In his mind. He didn't need to know watches. He sold them. The watchmaker in the back room, a quiet, brilliant, perpetually overbooked, Swiss-trained craftsman named Aldous Renner did the actual work. And Preston took the credit out front. The arrangement had held for 2 years. It was, in fact, Aldous Renner, who had called Della Mayfield. She didn't know that yet. Preston certainly didn't know it. But it matters. So hold on to it. 3 days before that Tuesday, Della had walked into this same boutique for the first time. gotten exactly the reception you'd expect, and been waved off by Preston before she'd finished her sentence. But Aldous, coming out from the back to retrieve a service ticket, had seen the watch in her hands as she turned to leave. He'd seen the caliber, and he had stopped dead, because Aldous Renner had a problem that week that was about to become a catastrophe. And he had just glimpsed, in the hands of a woman, his colleague was shooing out the door. The one thing on earth that might solve it. But let me come back to that. Let me show you the afternoon first. The way it actually unfolded. Minute by minute. Because the cruelty came in layers. And I want you to feel each one. 2 o'clock. Della returned to the boutique as she'd been asked to over the phone asked. Specifically, to come back at 2 and ask for the watchmaker. She did not know Preston would be the one to greet her. Preston did not know she'd been summoned. He saw her come through the glass door. The same woman from 3 days ago. And something in him curdled. "Oh, no," he said, before she'd taken 3 steps. "No. No. We did this already. I remember you." "Good afternoon," Della said. "I was told to come back today and ask for—" "You were told to come back." He said it like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. He leaned on the counter, both palms flat, and looked her up and down slow, theatrical, making a show of it for the young salesgirl restocking the perfume next door, who glanced over and then quickly away. Told by who? Did the bench by the gate tell you? Did a voice in the loudspeaker tell you? "Ma'am, nobody in this store told you to come back. Because nobody in this store wants you to come back." Della stood her ground. "A man called my home. Said his name was, I make the calls in this store. Sweetheart, and I have never dialed a number for you in my life. You know what I think? I think you got nothing to do all day. And a place like this, all the lights, all the shine. It's like a TV for people like you. You come stand in the glow. I get it, but I've got actual clients." He straightened, smoothed his tie down with 2 fingers, a little gesture he did constantly, a tidying of himself, as if he were forever putting himself back in order after the indignity of having to look at people like her. 20 past 2, I've got a gentleman flying out on a charter who is going to drop more in this store than you'll touch in a decade. And I am not having him walk in to find you parked here like furniture nobody claimed. So we're done. We were done 3 days ago." She didn't move. She reached into her tote, slowly, and brought out the chamois square, and began to unwrap it on the counter. Preston watched her do it with an expression of pure disbelief, as if she were committing some unthinkable act of trespass. He turned, deliberately, to the young salesgirl at the perfume counter, raising his voice so it would carry, performing it for her, for the corridor, for anyone. "You seeing this? Lena, you seeing this?" I tell her to leave and she starts setting up shop, unwrapping her little bundle on my display case. "This is what I deal with. This is the job. You think it's all charter clients and champagne? No, it's this. It's standing here while somebody who's never owned a thing in her life decides my counter's the place to finally feel important." He swung back to Della, and the false grin he'd put on for Lena dropped clean off his face. "Wrap it back up. I'm not telling you again. I don't care what's in the rag. I don't care if it's the last watch on earth. It could be solid gold and it'd still be the cheapest thing standing at this counter. And I'm looking right at the cheapest thing standing at this counter. And it isn't the watch." That was when his voice climbed back to the edge you heard at the start. "Stop. Don't put those hands on my glass. You heard the rest." Now here's the thing about Della Mayfield. The thing Preston Vale could not have known by looking. 38 years on a precision bench teaches you something beyond steady hands. It teaches you patience that has a floor of iron under it. She had been the only woman on her line for the first decade. She had been the only black woman on it for all 38 years. She had been talked over, talked down to, mistaken for the cleaning staff in her own department by visiting executives more times than she could count. And she had outlasted every single one of them. Because the parts didn't care who made them. The parts only cared if they were right. And hers were always right. So she had a great deal of practice standing very still, while a small man made a great deal of noise. She let him finish. She rewrapped the watch. Slow. Careful. The chamois folded back over the steel face the way you'd tuck a blanket around, something sleeping. And while she did it, Preston kept going. Because men like Preston cannot stand a silence they didn't make. Oh, that's precious, he said. Look at her, wrapping it up like it's the crown jewels. What is that? Anyway, let me guess. Granddaddy's watch. Some old beat-up thing some relative left you and you've been hauling it around to every shop in the city hoping somebody'll tell you it's worth something. I've seen 100 of you. You come in here with a $40 watch and a dish towel and you want me to tell you you're sitting on a fortune. Well, I'll save you the bus fare back. Honey, it's not. Whatever it is. If it was worth anything, it wouldn't be wrapped in a rag, in a bag that's losing a strap. Worth follows worth. That's just how it works. The watch tells you what the wrist is. And the wrist tells you what the watch is. And one look at you tells me everything about both. Della's hands paused. Just for a second. Over the chamois. That was the only sign. Then they kept folding. You don't even want to argue with me, Preston said. And he sounded almost delighted, mistaking her stillness for defeat. See, that's good. That's progress. Some of you, you want to make a scene. You want to call somebody. You want to talk about how you've got rights. You don't have rights in here. Sweetheart, this is private property and I'm the man with the keys. The only right you've got is the right to use that door on your way out. And I'm starting to think you don't even know how that works either. The young salesgirl at the perfume counter, Lena, had gone very quiet. She was holding a tester bottle she'd already restocked. Holding it for no reason. Because she couldn't make herself walk away, and she couldn't make herself speak up either. And the not doing of both was a thing that would keep her awake for nights afterward. And she said, again, in the same low, even tone, I'm not here to buy anything. Son. I'm here because somebody called me. He gave the name Aldous Renner. He said he needed help with something in the back. And for just a half second, something flickered across Preston's face, because that name he did know. That was the watchmaker. That was the man whose work he sold as his own. But the flicker died fast, smothered by the certainty that there was simply no possible world in which the brilliant, impossible to please Aldous Renner would summon this woman. Of all the people on earth. Into his workshop, Renner doesn't see walk-ins. Preston said, Renner doesn't see anybody. Renner barely sees me. You expect me to believe he picked up a phone and called you? You? Honey, I don't know where you got that name. Maybe you read it on a receipt somebody threw in the trash. Maybe you've been casing this store, but you are not getting anywhere near that back room. Now, I'm going to ask you one time. Nice. To leave. And then I'm going to ask the way I ask people who don't listen. Let me pause here. Because real talk, that's the part that gets me. Not leave. Not even the trash line. It's the way I ask people who don't listen. It's a man who has decided that this human being in front of him is a problem to be removed. And that he has the standing to escalate to removal. In a public place. Against a 73-year-old woman whose only crime was answering a phone call she'd been asked to answer. And she'd done nothing. That's worth sitting with. She had asked for an appointment she'd been given. That was the entire offense. Della looked at the door to the back room. It was steel, with a small reinforced window and through it she could see the edge of a workbench and the warm cone of a bench lamp. She raised her voice, just slightly, not a shout. A woman's clear voice, pitched to carry through glass. "Mr. Renner, you called me about a caliber. I'm here." Preston's hand shot out and slapped the counter. Do not yell in my store." "That's it. That's done it." He came around the end of the counter. Fast. It was at that exact moment that the businessman with the roller bag, a heavy-set man in a rumpled travel blazer, name of Hollis, who'd been pretending to browse the display while actually just watching the whole ugly thing unfold, finally spoke up. Hey, buddy." Hollis stepped forward, one hand half raised. "What are you doing? She's just standing there." "She hasn't done one thing." Preston rounded on him, and the tie smoothing came out automatic. The man reassembling himself for an audience that mattered. "Sir, I apologize. This doesn't concern you. I've got a situation with a person who won't leave." "A situation." Hollis looked at Della, at the wrapped watch in her hands, at the worn tote, and then back at Preston. And his face did something complicated. "She's a little old lady with a watch and a cloth." "The situation is you. I've been standing here 10 minutes. You've been at her the whole time." "Sir, don't sir me. I fly through here twice a month. I've bought from this counter, and I'm telling you, I am never spending another dime in a place where I watch the help corner somebody's grandmother." Hollis pulled out his phone. "Not to film, just held it." "What's your name? It's right there on the badge." "Preston." "Okay. Preston. I'm gonna remember that." And Lena, young Lena, who had been holding that tester bottle for no reason for 5 solid minutes, set it down with a small click and said, in a voice that shook but did not stop, "Preston." She did say a name. She said Aldous. "Maybe you should just go check with Aldous before you stay out of this." "Lena, this is not the perfume counter," she said Aldous. Though, it was right then, with Hollis holding his phone and Lena's small, brave voice still hanging in the air and Preston caught between 2 witnesses, that the steel door to the back room opened. "Let me hold us right there," at the worst of it, and back up 3 days. So you understand exactly what was waiting on the other side of that steel door and why Preston Vale had just made the single worst mistake of his professional life. 3 days earlier, the first time Della came in, she'd been brushed off by Preston in under a minute that day too. But on her way out, Aldous Renner had come through from the back carrying a service tray. And he had seen Earl's watch in her hands. And he had seen the caliber number stamped on the caseback. And he had stopped breathing for a second. Because Aldous Renner was, that week, in the worst professional crisis of his career, 11 days prior, a man had walked into the boutique and dropped off a watch for service. But not just any watch. And not just any man. The watch was an exceedingly rare mid-century complication, one of perhaps 40 ever made. Currently owned by a collector who happened to be one of the airport authority's biggest commercial tenants, a man with the power to renew or cancel the boutique's very lease. He'd left it for a routine service. And during that service, Aldous had discovered that a previous inferior watchmaker, years ago, had butchered the movement and left it limping along on a balance staff that was not original. Not correct. And now, at last, cracked. The watch needed a replacement balance staff for a caliber that had not been manufactured in over 60 years. No supplier had it. No catalog listed it. The only way to put that priceless watch right was for someone to cut a new staff from raw stock on a watchmaker's lathe to tolerances of microns, and to do it for a caliber whose original specifications were a closely guarded, half-lost thing. Aldous could cut a balance staff. But not this one. This caliber's geometry was famously brutally unforgiving, a known nightmare among watchmakers. And the 2 times in his life he'd attempted one, he'd failed. He'd spent 4 sleepless nights at his lathe trying again. He'd ruined 11 blanks. The collector was returning in a week to collect his watch. If it wasn't perfect, the lease was gone. The store was gone. And Aldous Renner's name, which was the only thing he truly owned, was gone with it. You have to understand what that name meant to him to understand his desperation. Aldous Renner had come up the hard way, too. In his own fashion, a kid from a nowhere town who'd talked his way into a watchmaking school in Switzerland on a scholarship and a prayer. Who'd spent his 20s being told his hands were good, but his pedigree was wrong. Who'd built a reputation one impossible repair at a time, until people stopped asking where he came from and started asking only whether he could fix the unfixable. The answer had always been yes. For 8 years, the answer had been yes. The Vance was the first watch in nearly a decade to make the answer no. He'd called the manufacturer's technical archive in Switzerland. The man who'd known that caliber's secrets had retired and then died. He'd called 2 colleagues he respected. Both had said the same thing, that staff's a coffin. Don't take the job. He'd taken it anyway, because the watch was already in his safe, and the lease was already on the line. And a man who built his name on yes doesn't know how to start saying no at 51. The night before, Della first walked in. Aldous had sat alone at his bench at 2 in the morning with the 11th ruined blank in front of him and his head in his hands. And for the first time in his career, he had thought the word that craftsmen are never supposed to think: beaten. He'd thought, I am going to lose everything because of a part smaller than a grain of rice. And there is no one left alive who can make it. And the next afternoon, a woman in a gray cardigan had walked through his door, holding that exact part, made by her own hand, in a watch wrapped in a dish towel, and his colleague had tried to throw her out. When Aldous thought about that, even months later, he had to sit down. The margin by which the whole thing had nearly been lost, by which the answer to his prayer had nearly been waved toward a pretzel stand and out the door forever. Simply because of how she looked, that margin kept him up at night, worse than the 11 ruined blanks ever had. Because the staff he could have eventually solved or not. But the part that haunted him was how close cruelty had come to costing everyone everything. And how it would have, if he'd happened to be 3 seconds slower coming through that door. That's the thing about treating people like they don't count. He'd say later, you never know which one of them is carrying the thing that saves you. And the not knowing is exactly the point, because you're supposed to be decent to all of them anyway, before you ever find out. On the chance and on the principle, both. And then a small woman in a gray cardigan had walked in holding a watch with that exact caliber stamped on the back running. Once. Clearly serviced beautifully at some point in its life. And Aldous Renner, who knew every authorized watchmaker in 3 states by name and reputation, had felt a wild, impossible hope. He'd followed her out into the corridor that day, past Preston. And the scene of it is worth slowing down for, because it was the gentlest thing that happened in this whole story, and it happened in the same spot where, 3 days later, the cruelest thing would, Ma'am, please. Aldous had caught up to her near the wine bar, slightly out of breath. A man who never left his bench, now standing in the open terminal. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for how that went in there. Would you let me see the watch? Just for a moment. I'm the watchmaker here. The actual one. Della had studied him. She'd had a lot of practice studying men who wanted something from her. Why? She'd said. Not unkind, just direct, 'cause I saw the case back. He'd said, I saw the caliber, and I have spent 11 nights losing my mind over that exact caliber. And I would like, very much, to know how a watch carrying it came to be in your hands. So she'd unwrapped it for him, right there, on a little cocktail table outside the wine bar. And he'd turned it over with the reverence of a man handling a relic. And he'd read the service marks scratched inside. D. M. He'd read aloud. And a date. 1989. He'd looked up. You know who did this work. I did. Della had said, I made the balance staff for it myself. Young man. Cut it on a Schablin lathe in 1989. My husband's watch. That caliber's a devil. Took me 3 tries to learn it back in the 80s. And I cut staffs for that movement for the manufacturer for the better part of 15 years after. I could do it in my sleep now. Cried over the first batch I ruined. Then I stopped ruining them. Aldous Renner had stood in that airport corridor and felt the ground move. He'd set the watch down very gently, as though it had become, in the last 30 seconds, far more precious than he'd realized, which it had. Mrs. I'm sorry. I don't. Mayfield. Della Mayfield. Mrs. Mayfield. He'd taken a breath. I am going to tell you something I probably shouldn't tell a stranger, because I am out of better options. There is a watch in my safe that is going to end my career on Friday, and you may be the only living person who can save it. Will you let me explain? Will you let me buy you a coffee? At least. For the way my colleague spoke to you, and Della had looked at this earnest, exhausted, suddenly hopeful man. And something in her, the part that had spent a career being the one they flew in, when everyone else had failed, had softened just slightly. I don't need coffee, she'd said, but you can tell me about the watch. I've got nowhere to be that's better than a good hard problem. That was how it had started. This caliber, the one that had defeated him, the one that was about to cost him everything. This woman had mastered it on a production line decades ago and cut hundreds of its impossible little staffs by hand. The skill he had been searching the country for, the skill that did not exist in any shop he could find, had walked into his store in worn shoes and been shooed toward the food court. He'd asked for her number. He'd promised to call. He had a plan that needed approval from the regional service director, and a workshop he'd have to get her cleared into. And so he'd told her, come back Tuesday at 2. Ask for me, and I'll have everything arranged. We will save this watch together, and I will pay you properly. And he'd hesitated, and I'm sorry for how my colleague spoke to you. He'd made the call. He'd cleared it with the director, who, hearing that the lease itself hung in the balance, had approved an outside contractor on the spot. Everything was arranged. The one thing Aldous had not done, the one thing that nearly broke the whole rescue, was tell Preston. Because Aldous worked in the back, head down, 16-hour days that week. And Preston ran the front, and the two of them barely spoke. And it had simply not occurred to Aldous that the woman who was about to save the entire store would be intercepted at the door by the man whose paycheck she was about to rescue. Which brings us back to the corridor. Preston coming around the counter, Della standing her ground, the businessman frozen with his roller bag, the salesgirl with the perfume bottle, and the steel door to the back room opening. Aldous Renner came out fast. Loop still flipped up on his glasses, an apron over his shirt. And he took in the scene in one glance. Preston advancing. Della cornered against the counter, the watch wrapped in her hands, and his face went white. Then a kind of furious gray. Preston, he said, what are you doing? Preston turned, all wounded innocence, smoothing his tie. Aldous. Hey, I'm handling it. This woman's been handling it. Aldous crossed the floor. He did not raise his voice. He had the kind of quiet that's worse than shouting. A precision in it. Every word cut to size. Do you know who this is? She's nobody. She keeps coming in claiming somebody. This is Mrs. Della Mayfield. Aldous turned to her. And this is the detail that undid the whole room. The brilliant, impossible-to-please master watchmaker. The man Preston had spent 2 years claiming to be, took off his glasses and gave Della Mayfield a small, formal bow of the head, the way one craftsman acknowledges another. A thing he had not done for any customer, any executive, any collector. In the entire 2 years Preston had known him. I called her, Aldous said. I called her at her home. 3 days ago. I asked her to come here today, at 2 o'clock, and to ask for me by name, which she did. Which I heard you, he turned back to Preston. And now the quiet had an edge that could shave steel, scream at her not to do. The corridor had gone very still. She is the only person in this region, possibly the only person in the country still living, who can cut a balance staff for the Vance complication in the safe. You remember the Vance. Preston, the watch you logged in. The watch whose owner holds our lease. The watch I have told you, every day for a week, that I could not finish. The watch that is going to close this store and end my career and put you out of a job on Friday when Mr. Vance walks in here to collect it. Preston's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I have ruined 11 blanks on that caliber. Aldous went on. Relentless. Gentle. Terrible. 11. I have not slept. And 3 days ago, the answer to my prayers walked through that door, holding a watch. She serviced herself in 1989. On a lathe. For the manufacturer, and you waved her toward the pretzel stand. And today, when I arranged for her to come back and save all of us, you came around your counter to put your hands near a 73-year-old woman to throw her out of the store. She is here to rescue. Here is the killer line. He said it looking not at Preston but at Della. Soft. Almost an apology to her, which made it land all the harder on the man it was about. You spent 2 years selling my hands as yours? Preston, and the one day, a pair of hands better than either of ours walked in the door. You couldn't even see them. Nobody moved. The salesgirl had set the perfume bottle down. The businessman with the roller bag had not gone anywhere. He was watching. Openly now. And Preston give him this. The instinct was at least human. Preston reached for the thing they always reach for. I didn't. Aldous. Come on. I didn't know who she, if I'd have known she was somebody. I never would have. Della Mayfield spoke then, for the first time in a while, and she did not raise her voice either. She had her husband's watch in her hands, and she looked at the young man very steadily. That's the whole sickness right there. Son, she said, if I'd known she was somebody, I was somebody when I walked in. I was somebody 3 days ago. I was somebody for 38 years on a bench you couldn't pass the entrance exam for. You didn't need to know I could cut that staff to treat me like a person. The cutting's just what makes you sorry. It's not what should have made you decent. Preston had no answer to that. There isn't one. He stood there with his hands at his sides. You want to know what I did for a living? Della went on. Gentler now. Almost tired. I made the small parts that hold the whole thing together, the ones nobody sees. You open up a watch, a real one, and the part everybody points at is the dial, the hands, the pretty face on the front. But the thing that actually keeps the time is a piece smaller than a grain of rice, turning back and forth in the dark, where nobody ever looks. That was my whole career. The part nobody looks at, the part that does all the work. She glanced, just once, at Lena, who had spoken up, and at Hollis with his phone, and then back at Preston. I made my peace with that a long time ago. Some of us are the dial. Some of us are the part in the dark. The watch doesn't run without the part in the dark. And a store doesn't run on the man out front, smoothing his tie. You'd have learned that today for free. If you'd had the sense to be kind to a stranger before you knew what she could do. Hollis put his phone away. He didn't need it. Lena had tears standing in her eyes. And Aldous Renner, beside Della, said quietly, "Come on back. Mrs. Mayfield, let me show you what we're up against." That quiet, that exact and merciful and devastating, that was the moment the whole thing turned over for good. Let me tell you what happened after, because the after matters as much as the turn. Aldous Renner walked Della Mayfield back through the steel door, into the workshop, and the door swung shut on Preston Vale standing alone in the middle of his bright store, with his hands at his sides. No tie left to smooth that would help him. In the workshop, Aldous showed her the Vance. He laid it on the bench under the lamp. Opened. The wounded movement bare. And Della pulled a stool up and flipped his loop down over her own eye without asking. Because some habits live in the body. And she looked. For a long time she looked, and then she made a sound. A small mm. The sound a person makes, recognizing an old adversary. And she said, "Hello again. You mean little thing?" She had cut hundreds of these. The geometry that had defeated Aldous 11 times was, to her, the shape of 15 years of her working life. "Whoever was in here before me did this," she said, tilting the movement toward the light. "See that? The staff's not original. Somebody made it too quick. Didn't respect the pivot radius. It's been wearing itself a little flatter every day for years. It didn't crack on you. Son, it was always going to crack. You just had the bad luck of being the one holding it when it finally gave." Aldous had leaned in. And despite everything, despite the lease and the deadline and the 11 ruined blanks, he'd felt the specific joy of a craftsman being taught something. "I kept trying to match the wear," he said. "I kept cutting to what was there. That's your whole problem right there." Della had set the loop down and looked at him. "You can't match a wrong. You match a wrong. You just make a slightly newer wrong. You go back to what it was supposed to be. From the start. From the manufacturer's drawing. And you cut that. You weren't failing because your hands are bad. Your hands are good. You were failing because you were copying somebody else's mistake and trying to make it perfect. Can't be done. A perfect copy of a broken thing is still a broken thing." Aldous had been quiet a moment. "That's almost a whole philosophy," he'd said. "It's a lathe lesson." Della had said, "But Earl used to say the same thing comes out of the lathe as comes out of everything else. If you listen. Now hand me that stock and quit looking at me like I hung the moon. I've got 2 days and a watch to save, and a young man up front who needs to learn. It isn't his store that hangs in the balance. It's whether anybody decent's still standing in it when the dust clears." It took her the better part of 2 days. The service director cleared her onto the bench officially. She was paid as a master contractor, at a rate that made Aldous insist they double it. And she let him. Because Earl would have laughed at her for not. She cut the staff from raw stock on the workshop's lathe, and the first one was nearly right, and the second one was perfect. And Aldous Renner watched a 73-year-old woman do in 2 days what he had failed to do in a week. And he did not feel small. He felt, he said later, like he'd finally met the bench's true master and gotten to hold the light for her. That's a particular kind of grace. When a proud man finds someone better and is only glad of it, the 2 days themselves were something to see. Della worked the way she'd always worked, slow, unhurried, talking to the metal under her breath, the way some people talk to plants. The first morning, Aldous had hovered, anxious, watching the deadline like a man watching a fuse. "You're crowding me." "Son," she'd said, not looking up. "A staff doesn't come faster because you stand over it worried. Go run the front of your store and let me run the back of it." There's no front to run. Preston's gone home. We're closed for the service. Then sit down over there and stop breathing on my chuck. He'd sat, and he'd watched. And over those 2 days, he'd watched her do the thing he'd spent 11 failed attempts trying to force. She didn't fight the caliber. She listened to it. She'd turn the lathe a few microns. Stop. Feel. Turn again. She talked the whole time. Half to him and half to herself. People think the hard part's the cutting, she'd said on the second day. The perfect staff, taking shape under the loop. It's not. Any fool with a steady hand can take metal off. The hard part's knowing exactly when to stop. Take one pass too many, and you've got scrap. The whole skill of 50 years is in the stopping. Not the cutting, same as most things. If you think about it, knowing when you've done enough, and not ruining it by pushing. She'd glanced up at him. Your problem wasn't your cutting. It was you couldn't stop chasing a wrong number. Once you've got the right number to chase, the stopping's easy. When she finished, when the staff was seated and the vance ran clean. Sweeping. Alive. Aldous had stood there, looking at it for a long time. And then at Hare. And he'd said, I've been the best watchmaker in 3 states for 8 years. They flew me in from Geneva, and I just watched you do something I couldn't do. Like it was nothing, while telling me how to do it. It wasn't nothing. Della had said, it was 50 years. You'll get there. You've got the hands. You just need the miles. And she'd started cleaning her tools, and that had been that when Mr. Vance came in that Friday to collect his complication, it ran perfectly, to within seconds a day. The old wound healed by a hand that had healed it 100 times before. The lease was renewed. The store survived. Aldous made sure insisted, to the service director and to the regional company itself, that the records show exactly whose hands had saved it. Della Mayfield, master watchmaker, retired, cutter of the impossible Vance staff. The collection itself is worth telling, because Della was there for it, by Aldous' insistence. Vance was a brisk, precisa man, the kind who wears his wealth like a uniform. And he'd come expecting bad news. Half-braced to be told his irreplaceable watch couldn't be saved. Aldous handed it to him running. Vance held it to his ear, then to a timing app on his phone, and watched the numbers settle. And his careful face cracked open into something almost boyish. It's perfect, he said. It's better than it's been since I bought it. Who did this? You said on the phone you'd had trouble. I had failed. Aldous said simply, 11 times. This watch was beyond me. It was saved by her. And he stepped aside. And there was Della in her gray cardigan. And Aldous said, Mr. Active, Vance, this is Mrs. Della Mayfield. She cut staffs for this exact caliber for the manufacturer for 15 years. She is the reason your watch runs. And the reason this store still has its doors open Monday. Vance had looked at her, and here's the thing. Here's the small grace note. Vance was a man who'd walked past 1,000 people like Della without a glance. And he knew it. You could see him know it. And he put out his hand and shook hers like she was the most important person in the building. Because in that moment, she was Mrs. Mayfield. He said, I don't know how to thank you. You can wind it gentle and not let some hack put a wrong staff in it again. Della said, That's thanks enough. It's a good watch. Treat it like one. The lease was signed 2 days later, and while she was at it, in the spare hours, with Aldous holding the light and learning from her, Della brought Earl's chronograph back to life. She made the part it needed herself, on that same lathe, and she cleaned and oiled the old movement. And on the second evening she wound it. And it began After 3 years of silence, to tick, she'd worked on Earl's watch last. On purpose. The way you save the thing that matters most, for when your hands are warmed up and sure. Aldous had offered to do it for her. You've earned a rest. Let me, and she'd said no. Not unkindly. That this one was hers to do, and always would be. He'd understood. And he'd stayed anyway. Holding the light. Because some jobs shouldn't be done alone, even if they have to be done by one pair of hands. When the new staff was seated, and the movement was clean, and the bridges were back down, she'd held the crown between 2 fingers and looked at it a long moment. You don't have to wind it tonight, Aldous had said softly. It'll be here tomorrow. No. Della had said, Earl never put off a thing that was ready. Drove me crazy. If it was ready, it got done. And she'd wound it. Slow. Feeling the mainspring take up its old tension under her thumb. The resistance, building the way it had, built 10,000 mornings on his wrist, and then she'd set it down on the bench and waited. For a second, nothing. The old fear that it wouldn't catch. Then the balance gave a small shiver and swung. And caught. And swung again. And the watch began to tick steady. Even alive. And the sound of it filled that little back room. The sound she had fallen asleep to for 31 years. She held it to her ear, and she cried. Just a little. And Aldous Renner, who understood watches, and the people who loved them better than almost anyone alive, quietly left the room and let her have it. When she came out, her eyes were dry, and the watch was on her wrist. And she said only, It runs. And Aldous said, Of course it does. And neither of them said anything else about it. Because some things don't need words laid over them. Now, Preston, I'll be honest with you. Because this story isn't a fairy tale, and I don't want to sell you one. Preston Vale did not get hauled off in handcuffs. There were no police. No one had touched anyone. The law has nothing to say about a man being cruel and small. What happened to Preston was both less dramatic and, I think, more fitting. The salesgirl from the perfume counter, her name was Lena, had seen the whole thing. And so had the businessman with the roller bag. And neither of them let it go quietly. The businessman, it turned out, wrote to the regional company. Lena, who'd watched Preston treat people that way for months and had been too junior and too scared to say anything, finally did say something. And the regional service director, who now knew exactly how close Preston had come to costing the company its lease by trying to throw its savior out the door, did not need much convincing. Preston wasn't fired in a blaze. He was quietly moved off the airport store, the high-traffic, high-commission post he'd schemed his way into, and sent back to a smaller location in the city. No longer managing anyone. No longer the face of anything. He kept a job. He lost the thing he'd actually wanted, which was the standing to look down on people. The store no longer let him stand at the front of the case and decide who counted. There was one more scene with Preston, and I'll tell it. Because it's not the one you'd expect, and that's exactly why it belongs here. About a month after, on one of Della's monthly visits to the airport bench, Preston came back. Not to work. He didn't work there anymore. He came as a person, on his day off, having driven out from the city. And he waited by the wine bar until Della came out at the end of the day. And he stood in front of her, with his hands jammed in his pockets, and no counter between them, and no tie to smooth. And he said, Mrs. Mayfield, can I have a minute? Della looked at him a long moment, the way she'd looked at him that first day. You can have a minute. I came to say I'm sorry. He got it out fast. Like he'd practiced it in the car, which he had. Not the kind of sorry I said that day. That one was sorry I got caught. Sorry you turned out to matter. This one's different. I've been thinking about what you said. The part about the dial and the part in the dark. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I spent my whole life trying to be the dial, the face out front, and I treated everybody I figured for a part in the dark like they were nothing. Because I thought that's how you got to be the face. And it turns out the face isn't even the thing that works. I was so busy being the dial, I never once kept the time. Della didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that's a real apology. I'll give you that. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Preston said. I just wanted you to hear it from me. Standing up, not behind a counter. Forgiveness isn't mine to hand you anyway. Son. Della said, that's between you and the next stranger who walks up to wherever you're standing. You want to make this right. You won't do it with me. You'll do it with somebody you've got no reason to be kind to, who can't do one thing for you, who you'll never see again. That's the only place it counts. Anybody can be sorry to the person who turned out to matter. The whole trick is being decent to the one who doesn't, before you know. And even if you never find out. Preston nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. All right then. And she'd patted his arm once. The way you might, a young man you had no reason to be kind to, and walked on to catch her bus. And that was the last she saw of him. Whether he learned it, I can't tell you. The story doesn't get to follow him home. But he stood up and drove an hour to say it to her face. And that's more than most people manage. And I've decided to let that be enough. The way she did. And here's the part I find I can't stop thinking about. The regional company, partly because of the letter and the complaints, instituted a small training requirement for its front retail staff. Every person who works the floor of an authorized service boutique now spends a half day in the back with the watchmaker, watching the actual work get done so that no one selling those watches can pretend to themselves that the magic happens out front, in the lights, with the tie smoothing, instead of in the back, at the bench, in the patient, impossible hands of people the front of the store would never think to look at twice. They didn't name it after anyone. It's just a half-day rule in an employee handbook. But Aldous told Della it should have been called the Mayfield Half-Day. And she laughed at him and told him to get back to work. Della Mayfield wears her husband's chronograph now. Every day. On her own wrist. It keeps good time. When it gets near 4:12 in the afternoon, she sometimes notices. And sometimes she doesn't. And she's decided that's all right, that a watch is for going forward. Not for staying stopped at the worst hour of your life. She goes out to the airport boutique once a month or so. By arrangement. To take on the jobs nobody else can do and to teach Aldous the calibers that defeated him. And the two of them have become, of all the unlikely things, friends. The proud Swiss train master and the woman in the gray cardigan he once watched get waved toward a pretzel stand. Lena's still there, too. After what she saw, and after what she found the nerve to say. That small shaking, she did say a name that turned out to be the first crack in Preston's whole performance. Something shifted in her. She started asking Aldous if she could watch the work in the back on her breaks. Turned out she had a real curiosity for it. A good eye. The last Della heard, Lena had enrolled in a watch repair course at the community college, paying her own way. And Aldous had written her a recommendation and let her practice on movements in the back room after hours. The girl who'd been too scared to speak had decided she didn't want to spend her life at the front of the case anymore. She wanted to be the part in the dark that actually does the work. Della had heard that and smiled for a whole bus ride. On one of those monthly visits, a few months in, a young man came up to the boutique counter, flustered. Late for a flight. A watch in his hand that had stopped, and Lena, working the front now and then while she learned, started to wave him toward a kiosk down the concourse out of pure habit. The way you do when someone's rushed. And the answer is usually no. And then she stopped herself. Della watched her stop herself, watched her take a breath, and put the brush off back down, and say instead, "Let me see it. We might be able to help you right here." And it turned out to be a simple thing. A stem come loose. 2 minutes work. And the young man made his flight and never knew how close he'd come to being waved off. Never knew he'd been the stranger somebody chose to be decent to before, knowing one single thing about him. Della never said anything to Lena about it. Didn't need to. But on the bus home, she thought, that's it. That's the whole thing. Not the watch in the safe. Not the lease. Not even Earl's chronograph ticking on her wrist. Just a young woman choosing in the half second where it would have been easier not to treat a stranger like he counted. That's where it lives. That's where it always lived. She never had to prove anything to deserve better than she got that day. That's what I keep coming back to. The skill is the reason this particular story has an ending you can cheer for. But the skill is not the reason she deserved to be treated like a human being when she walked in. She deserved that the second she came through the door. The hands just made Preston sorry. They didn't make her worthy, she was already that. The way every single person who walks up to your counter already is, before you know one single thing about them. That's the whole thing. Really. That's what Preston couldn't see, with all his lights and all his glass. Now look, I'll tell you straight, the way I always do. This story is fiction. Della and Preston and Aldous and the watch in the safe. I made them up to tell you something true. But the thing underneath it is not made up at all. There are people getting waved toward the pretzel stand every single day. In stores and offices and waiting rooms. By someone who's decided in half a second that they don't count, and most of those people don't happen to be the one person on earth who can cut the staff that saves the store. Most of them just walk back out into the corridor carrying whatever they came in with. And we never find out what they could have done. Because nobody ever held the light for them. So let me ask you this, and I really do want you to tell me in the comments. Have you ever been Della? Waved off and underestimated and made to stand there and take it? Or be honest? Because most of us have a little Preston in us on a bad day. Have you ever been the one who decided too fast that somebody didn't matter? What changed it? What made you see? And here's the harder one. The one I keep asking myself. How many Dellas have walked up to your counter, your literal counter, or your office, or your front porch, or just your line at the store and turned around and walked back out before you ever found out who they were? You'll never know. That's the terrible mercy of it. You don't get the ending where the watchmaker comes out of the back room to tell you what you almost threw away. You just get the half second. Every single day, where you decide who counts, and nobody's watching, and nobody's grading you. And that's exactly what makes it the whole test. Tell me below. Share this with somebody who needs the reminder that you cannot read a person's worth off their shoes. And if these stories mean something to you, subscribe and stay a while. There's always another one coming. Because everybody who walks up to the counter is already somebody. The only question is whether you've got the eyes to see it before they have to prove it. Della had the hands. Most people just have the right to be treated like they're somebody. Both should be enough.